You know, it's not every day when you can say this. Helmut Marko? He's actually got a point. Because Ferrari just keep giving themselves headaches. With the Red Bull special advisor effectively being told to butt out of all the main Red Bull drama, Helmut Marko has instead taken himself to talking about Checo in a good light, then starting to turn up the heat on Daniel Ricciardo. And then there was this take regarding Ferrari, which got me thinking, is Lewis Hamilton necessarily the best idea Ferrari could come up with? Now, I can already feel the pitchforks of the internet. The internet does not like that. Calm down, will you? I'm not dissing Lewis. In fact, I think what he's doing is a great idea for himself. As far as I'm concerned, Lewis has pulled a masterstroke maneuver which has not only realised a personal dream of his of racing in red, but it's also guaranteed financial support for many of his initiatives for the long haul, from the likes of the chairman of Ferrari, John Elkann, who also runs up the holding company Exor, who has been guaranteeing many of the initiatives and campaigns that Lewis has championed over the years, and said basically, whatever you want, I'll pay for it. So effectively, Ferrari have given Lewis a blank check to do whatever he wants to try and further all of the stuff that he's going to do once he hangs up his helmet and quits Formula One. So realistically, from a business perspective, Lewis was a really smart cookie this time around. But I'm not quite sure whether that will translate to on-track performance, and Helmut Marko's comments really gave me pause for thought, and I'll talk more about that later. So I'm just going to briefly talk about the financial side of things, and I know financial stuff can easily be quite dry, but it is quite fascinating, because signing Lewis Hamilton is going to be costing Ferrari upwards of $100 million a year, supposedly. But, I hear you say, you might be able to counter that by saying, oh well, Ferrari's stock price has increased by $6 billion since he arrived, therefore they have more money. Well, that is very true. The value of Ferrari has gone up considerably since Lewis Hamilton signed for Ferrari, much like when Aston Martin signed Sebastian Vettel, and their value went up as well because of four-time world champion driver for your F1 team. That's a big deal. But there's a little bit of a catch here, is that, sure, Ferrari's worth more, but that's not giving you $6 billion extra dollars in cash on hand that you can use readily like an ATM machine. No, what they have instead is something called cash on hand or cash reserves. That's the money that you can use on the fly to either pay for stuff to do with your company, or if you want to acquire at a company, you can just say, I have this much, I'm going to use that. And according to Macro Trends, Ferrari's current cash on hand reserve is about $1.2 billion. And the worrying thing about that is that it's steadily decreasing over the last couple of years. And that's from the car company Ferrari, mind you. But when it comes to the Scuderia, that's not really quite well known. But most likely, John Elkann is seeing the Lewis Hamilton acquisition from a Ferrari car company business point of view. This is good business, so I wouldn't be surprised that Ferrari's cash reserves from the car company are used to fund Lewis Hamilton's acquisition, as well as keeping him sweet by paying for some of his investments and paying for some of his initiatives, as well as dipping into his own company where he is the CEO. Because John Elkann, he does get around, as well as the Agnelli family. Don't worry, I'm done with the dry stuff now, but it is important to remember here, folks, and this is probably one of the facets of the Ferrari-Hamilton deal that people don't really talk about. By getting Lewis Hamilton to race for Ferrari, you're also getting the Lewis Hamilton juggernaut of a brand. He transcends Formula One. Lewis Hamilton is a name which is pretty much recognizable no matter where you are. He is a household name, and some people sometimes don't even know that he has anything to do with Formula One. They just hear Lewis Hamilton and go, oh yeah, Lewis Hamilton from Fortnite, because yes, Lewis Hamilton, he's a Fortnite character now. And no other mega champion has had that much brand recognition before. Sure, I hear you say, Michael Schumacher and Ferrari. That was a pretty big mega brand, wasn't it? Well, yes, in now, but when you go back to the 2000s, Michael Schumacher was a name that rarely came into parlor outside of the Formula One bubble. I don't remember Michael Schumacher really being much of a household name when I was a child. You really had to know about Formula One or motorsport to really get that, but nowadays, Lewis Hamilton and Mercedes, they have a strong brand recognition. You don't necessarily have to be a Formula One fan. And all of this is off the back of Formula One becoming much more internet savvy, as well as embracing social media since Liberty Media bought the sport. Say what you will about what Liberty Media is doing with Formula One. They certainly know how to get Formula One all abuzz with people who don't necessarily follow the sport, because that is one thing Bernie Ecclestone really didn't take to. I remember when they begrudgingly started a YouTube channel around 2015. You can tell they really didn't put much effort into it. Call me cynical here, but I really have have to be honest, and I'm probably just going to hold some tinfoil right here. I believe that the Lewis Hamilton acquisition was more of a business decision than a racing decision. Because technically, Ferrari doesn't need to advertise in the traditional sense. And that is something that very few companies can do. Think about it. Have you ever seen a typical TV or internet ad about a car made by Ferrari, or something that Ferrari produces? Odds are you probably haven't, and there is good reason for that, because Ferrari, they just let their cars speak for themselves. They use all of the sports and disciplines that they compete in to showcase that a Ferrari is a brilliant car and that you should buy one if you can afford one. Or if you can't afford one, you should lust for one and have a poster of it in your bedroom to one day acquire one. And Formula One was a major part of that strategy, and still is. And Lewis Hamilton joining them is yet another chapter of that ongoing story. You might be thinking I'm a little bit cynical here, but I do think that there is some credence to this theory, that Lewis Hamilton going to Ferrari is mainly just an advertising exercise. It's a marketing campaign on the part of John Elkann to try and accelerate the brand of Ferrari even more. Put two mega brands together and you come with an uber brand. Ferrari and Lewis Hamilton is something that you don't often see. That level of prominence, that's remarkably rare. It almost doesn't matter what he does on track. His legacy, Lewis Hamilton's, has been secured, and now he will be permanently associated with the likes of Ferrari. And if he does do well on track, then the Tifosi will adore him until the end of time. In fact, they pretty much adore any Ferrari driver so long as they don't crash it into a wall or they're Luca Badoa. But is all of this at the Scuderia's expense though? Is this all just for the Ferrari car company? As I mentioned in previous videos, there has been an historic pact between Enzo Ferrari and Gianni Agnelli, the latter being the owner of Fiat at the time and owning a Ferrari, and the grandfather of the current chairman John Elkann. What that pact meant is that Agnelli assured Enzo Ferrari that the car company itself and Fiat would have very little influence as to what was going on with the Scuderia Ferrari Formula One team, meaning that Enzo Ferrari could just basically go racing and worrying about that part of the business instead of worrying about the day-to-day running of the company or having to deal with the road car side of things for the most part. And also, he wouldn't be told what to do. Sometimes over the years, I felt that pact has been tested, that sometimes the car company has influenced the Formula One team to a point where you think that that pact has really been diluted to almost nothing, but now I think it's the most diluted it's ever been. John Elkann, the chairman of Ferrari, has basically proclaimed many times that he was the instigator of getting Lewis Hamilton to Ferrari in the first place. All of these backroom deals, all of these flirtations, casual meetings, and just multiple times of him coaxing Lewis to go and join Ferrari for once, with big money deals, and then of course the acquisition of Fred Vasseur, who at this point has basically nurtured half the grid. This pact has become the most tenuous it's ever been, with the car company dictating what the F1 team does. And sure, I'm pretty sure that Fred Vasseur is happy to work with Lewis one more time, but I don't necessarily think it's in the best interests of the F1 team right now because of what's been going on lately. But in a way, this was sort of inevitable, because Formula One, it's the most popular it's ever been. And Ferrari is the only team, bar Mercedes, to have pulled in a substantial profit. That's at least over $40 million over the course of a year. It would make sense to enhance said profit even further by signing the 7-time world champion, and the residual effects would play themselves out. After all, I'm sure that many more Mercedes cars were sold because of the fact that Lewis Hamilton drove for them for the better part of a decade. And I'm pretty sure that once Lewis Hamilton has disappeared, many Mercedes sales would have suddenly disappeared into the ether. They would never happen, and that many posters of Mercedes cars on bedrooms would then be discarded in the favour of Ferrari. But this is where Marco's comments specifically really hit home with me. These remarks stem from the arrival of Oliver Bearman, who subbed in for Carlos Sainz in Jeddah. Yes, I know, you're probably sick to death about hearing about Oliver Bearman, but his performance in Jeddah is something you cannot ignore. He does play a huge part in this discussion. The race's video went into his performance all the more intricately, but the outfit pointed out that Bearman's performance could have been better, and maybe even a P5 finish was on the cards, had instances in qualifying transpired in the Brits' favour, and he corrected some mistakes of his. But even then, that video was showing that over the course of the race, Bearman's performance was getting ever closer to Leclerc's, to the point where sometimes it was almost equal, and that level of progression is something that many teams would be taking into consideration. And you can tell that Bearman was hustling in that car to the point where, if you look at one of the onboard cameras, his headrest on the right side is crumpled. I didn't even know headrests could do that. His neck must have been caning afterwards. But okay, Here's where Marco's comments really come into play, so, pay attention to these ones. It's good food for thought. Ahem. I thought Bearman's debut in the Ferrari was sensational. To drive like that on a track like Jeddah without much practice was really strong. But what will Ferrari do now? They bought the expensive Hamilton, Leclerc has a longer-term contract, and now Bearman is a super talent. If I were Fred Vasseur, I would immediately find Bearman an F1 cockpit in another team, at Haas for example. Now they're going to have to spend money again to train him. The teams are currently relatively financially saturated. They will pay dearly for that. This piece from Speedweek is really quite loaded because immediately Helmut Marko deems Hamilton as expensive, not good value for Ferrari. And even making a comment about the worth of Lewis Hamilton means that he probably thinks that the acquisition of Ferrari of Lewis might not necessarily have been the most sound of business moves. And especially when you got somebody like Bearman and even Carlos Sainz doing the goods and probably a lot cheaper than what Lewis is. And Bearman probably would be coming in with a base salary of $500,000 a year, and you could get P7s or maybe a top 5 finish if it were on the cards and everything worked well in qualifying. And that level of progression could have been even better. And Jeddah, it's an incredibly strenuous track on the body. So that's even more impressive. And I know what you're going to say, that Bearman was in the second fastest car and he was able to do that. Liam Lawson was able to get a 9th place finish in one of the worst cars. That is something you have to acknowledge. And Helmut Marko does acknowledge Liam Lawson's existence and how he compares to Bearman. And yes, Lawson should be in Formula One too. All the more so. And with Bearman now proving himself worthy of Formula One far sooner than expected, his arrival will now come with an additional cost for Ferrari, since he's now a known commodity in the sport. He had a competitive yardstick in Charles Leclerc, who the car is tailored to specifically. And also, he was able to hold off the likes of Norris and Hamilton, everyone expecting them to catch up to him, and yet they didn't. And those two drivers then praising him, and including Max Verstappen praising him as well. You know you've done well when you've got all of the world champions giving you a big thumbs up. And now that he's had this experience, he will most likely undergo a more intensive training program. And now it's come to light that Bearman will indeed be driving more of the F175, that's the Ferrari 2022 car, at Fiorano. So he'll probably be getting more and more sessions of that as time progresses, because that's what Piastri did with Alpine, and that's what many other teams are probably going to be emulating. The byproduct of Oliver Bearman's performance is that maybe the F1 teams might take risks and invest in young drivers again. Then there is the matter of getting Bearman that existing seat, and everyone is reckoning that he will probably spend a couple of years at Haas, and Haas do want him. Even though they had a bad time of it with rookies a couple of years ago, Oliver Bearman has proved himself now in a competitive car that he is worthy of being in Formula One. Not to mention that Haas have now worked with Bearman at these FP1 sessions and they like him, they like his work ethic. And also, they will like the fact that Ferrari will subsidise his salary. Because according to various reports, Mick Schumacher, when he was driving for Haas, he was part of the Ferrari Driver Academy, and half of his salary was paid for by the Scuderia itself, and the rest of it coming from various other sponsors. So that does mean, in terms of what Marko said, there will be additional costs, because trying to get Bearman a seat in Formula One will not come cheap. So even though it's just a few $100,000 extra, and that money could easily go to producing a car part or some kind of logistical thing, or paying for multiple members of staff. It's money that is not in the Scuderia Ferrari's pockets anymore. But going back to Lewis Hamilton, you definitely get the feeling that the idea of getting him in Ferrari is an idea of the Scuderia to try and get ever closer to Red Bull. Bring in the 7-time world champion in a car that is clearly going places and is deemed the second fastest car, and see what happens when you put him up against Max Verstappen. But the thing is though, is that I don't really think it's a worthwhile fit at this time, because the style of the Ferrari car right now doesn't seem to be gelling well with Lewis's style. And then when you take into account what's been going on with the W15, that makes it all the more jittery, because supposedly the W15 was tailored to Lewis Hamilton's driving style. Lewis spent more time in the simulator than ever before, and more time in the factory than ever before, to make exactly sure that Mercedes followed his instructions and feedback to the letter, that they wouldn't ignore his feedback like they seemingly had done for the W14. He's been supervising that car more than he has done with any other car throughout his entire career, and he is still having some issues. But there was an interesting piece from Racing News 365's Jake Nicol that might have solved some of the problems as to why Lewis isn't doing quite so well with George Russell, and it's got something to do with that sexy subject of setups. Nickel points out a problem that Lewis is finding more often, and that he is spending more and more time in free practice experimenting with multiple setup solutions to try and get the exact configuration of car that he wants, which then allows Russell to forge a that'll do sort of setup and just go with it. And to be fair, George Russell is a little bit more versatile because he had to put up with a Williams car that really wasn't that fast for 3 years, so any car that has a vague sense of speed or manipulation or versatility will suffice. And also you get the feeling that Lewis Hamilton might have mentally checked out from Mercedes already, probably sensing that something was going down with Mercedes, and the fact they had to change their car concept again was a little bit of a red flag. And then you've also got to take into consideration that Toto has realized that there is a fundamental issue with the W15 and that it does need to be fixed. Even though it does have some interesting things, including that front wing, it does have some potential in of itself, but there is still some things to fix. And I'm not surprised by that at all. It's a brand new car again. It's going to take time to fix. I don't think it's going to be ready for prime time until we get to Canada. That is one of Lewis's stronger tracks, and if they do bring a configuration that is track specific that will tailor itself to Lewis, then I think he will kick on and do well. But for these first few races, these exploratory sessions, if this analysis from Nickel is true, and Lewis is spending most of his free practice time tinkering with setups to get it just right, and not being at least a little bit more accommodating, then he's going to lose important track time in getting acclimated, and then George Russell is going to romp off and make it 2-1 in his favour in terms of beating Lewis for the points. And this is with a car that Lewis Hamilton had a hand in making sure that worked well for him. When you put him in the 2025 Ferrari car, and remember, Lewis can't work with Ferrari at all until 2025 begins, that is going to make it all the more concerning because this car, the Ferrari car, is tailored to Charles Leclerc primarily. It just so happens that Carlos Sainz is quite adaptable and seemingly is able to work with it, much like how Oscar Piastri just so happens to work well with the car that has been tailored to Lando Norris, which makes McLaren all the more happy because they don't have to worry about tailoring to one specific driver. Both drivers like it, and that makes development all the better. But when you get two drivers whose driving styles are quite different, or they are a little bit contrasting, that's when you get a little bit of a problem as to where do you take the car. Do you keep it going along the side of where Charles Leclerc is going, or do you then change course and make the new car in the 2026 regulation cycle tailored to Lewis, and then spurn the likes of Charles Leclerc, who, according to Marco, is a long-termer? Or do you just take the risk? Do you just tailor yourself to Lewis Hamilton and run the risk of Charles Leclerc getting disillusioned and going somewhere else? The dream of getting a championship with Ferrari all the lesser. Marco is right. There are so many headaches that Ferrari are giving themselves off track that they needn't do, because Carlos Sainz has been doing the business. And yes, he does get quite uppity and he does take initiative sometimes, but when he does take initiative, it does translate to results. And then you got Oliver Bearman stepping in almost instantly and getting points, and probably would have been in the top 5 had he managed to get his qualifying lap just so. Whatever happens, Lewis Hamilton will be better off in himself than staying at Mercedes forever. He'll be kickstarting his life after F1 with his off-track work getting much needed collateral and coverage, which will matter to him more once he retires. But in the short term on track, I think it's going to be a little bit of a mismatch. I don't think 2025 with Lewis Hamilton is going to be quite that harmonious. There is going to be some sense of discord, it's going to be a bit of a rocky start, but maybe 2026 might yield some better results. But I don't think it's going to be that much of a just sliding yourself in and getting results right from the get-go, like Sebastian Vettel had, thankfully, when he joined Ferrari in 2015. I think this has been a good decision, sort of, for the car company, because bringing in a mega brand like Lewis Hamilton and them driving for Ferrari and driving Ferrari cars and promoting Ferrari cars across the world, that's a huge plus. The car company will be absolutely fine. But I don't think that the Scuderia will be getting the ideal results that they wanted in 2025. It might be just a case of, let's just get Lewis settled in for 1 year and then see what happens in 2026. And who would have thought that Helmut Marko would have given me pause for thought about Ferrari, as well as an 18-year-old chap from Essex? F1, eh? But what about Mercedes? Will they be okay without Lewis? Well, I think so. And if you want to find out why I think this, go and watch this video next, because I think that Mercedes, without the pressure of Lewis Hamilton, will thrive and evolve.